So I am so very excited for y'all to meet our co-host today, Shanta Loecker. Before we get started with our conversation, I want to give you a brief bio of her amazing background. So Shanta is the founder of 7525 Impact, which empower coaches, educators, and leaders to build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations. She firmly believes that integrating the principles of cultural humility, inclusive leadership, and transformative justice into communities brings strategic value and sustainability to all lines of work. Her social impact experience spans numerous industries, including, but not limited to, collaborations with leaders in college athletics, the nonprofit sector, small business startups, and K-12 education. Shanta is a veteran of intercollegiate athletics world. She has 15 years of experience spanning D1, D2, D3, and international programs, including 14 seasons as head coach of lacrosse. Her list of achievements includes coaching in 13 straight conference tournaments, 2 NCAA tournaments, 14 All-American selections, 2 conference championships, competitive international recruitment, and in-depth team and player development. Born in India, Shanta is a transracial adoptee and dedicated advocate for international adoptee rights. Over the last 3 decades, Shanta has lived in a diverse mix of social, political, economic climates, including Los Angeles, California, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Grand Junction, Colorado, and Chicago, Illinois. A graduate of the UCLA Department of Communication Studies, Shanta produced UCLA Next, a student Emmy-winning university television program during her time on campus. In addition to her coaching career, she has professional experience in leadership development, public speaking, musical performance, marketing and social media management, fundraising, and community outreach. I am so very impressed. And that was a mouthful of awesome experience, but I want to ask you all to join me in welcoming Shanta today to the conversation. Hello, Shanta. So I know we just went over your bio, but if there's a way you can introduce yourself in a way that wasn't covered in the bio, can you please share with us?
Sure. I will be honest, I didn't know you were going to read all of that. So I don't know if anyone ever gets used to hearing all of that about themselves, but I really appreciate it. Thank you for the kind introduction, Lauren. And first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and just your openness in terms of all of this, taking off. So um, I guess for me, rather than kind of reintroducing myself because I think you did a wonderful job. Thank you. I wanted to just define transracial adoptee for people just in case it isn't familiar. So essentially, a transracial adoptee is just someone that has been adopted by parents that have a different race or culture. So that's all that means. And then as far as international, sometimes other adoptees, it's interchangeable with like intercountry or transnational adoptee, and hear that as well. But other than that, from the more personal side, because we kind of covered all the professional stuff, I've always kind of identified more as an artist than a leader, coach, any of that stuff. And creativity has sort of always been my driving force. And I love sharing that because hopefully it's sort of humanizing as we go through all of this stuff. And even in the DEI world, sometimes it's like, the nature of talking about systems of oppression is a bit dehumanizing. So just mentioning that because it's a big part of who I am.
Absolutely, I love that. And Shanta, if you don't mind, I want to share with the audience how we first connected.
Yeah.
So I wrote a blog for Nika White Consulting, and I was speaking about psychological safety from the perspective that depending on past trauma and life experiences, you won't always receive psychological safety practices and gestures in a positive way. So for example, I used myself as an example, a Black woman who grew up around all white people, and I experienced microaggressions and racism and some poor experiences. So when I went into the business world and I was in a boardroom with all white people, they could be as friendly and welcoming as possible, but I still had a little bit of trauma and hesitance in accepting their gestures. So then on the other end, I ignorantly used the example of an Asian American woman that was adopted by all white people. And I said, because I grew up around all white people and had a white family, they were comfortable around white people, and it was rainbows and butterflies. And it was an ignorant statement to make. And you kindly and graciously reached out and just corrected me, and I fixed the blog right away. But it made me think of two things: that one, we don't speak about this enough. There's not enough conversations about it. And two, even as a double minority, being a woman, being a Black woman in this space, you still make mistakes. So I like to mention that to my white friends, because some people are like, oh, I don't want to speak because I'm afraid of making mistakes. There's cancel culture, blah, blah. But I think as long as you receive feedback in a way that will help you grow, it's important to get that feedback. So I really appreciated that experience. And I just wanted to share how we met. So I want to dig in a little bit more into your transracial, I'm sorry, this is life, I'm sorry, adoption experience.
All good.
So if you can share, please kind of share your experience growing up, where you're from, how you got into the DEI space. I'd love to hear that.
Sure. First of all, I have a couple dogs, so that might happen on this end too. Apologies to everyone. So no worries. Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, give that some larger context, because that was a really interesting interaction, to be honest, and I so appreciate the way that you managed it. It was just like the most amazing surprise to have that level of openness and vulnerability, so thank you. But to give some context, so 73% of parents of adoptees of color in the US are white. And then 92% of those adoptees are adopted internationally. So there's a lot of us. So, it makes sense that that would come to mind as an example of something. And it also makes sense that, that narrative that we so often hear societally is pretty narrow, and so I say that in your defense in terms of just that understanding and love that you welcomed, another perspective. Um, yeah, that said, as far as my lived experience, I think for me, it's best described as like in this DEI world, we're always talking about moving from either or mindsets to both and, right? And I feel like that could not be more relevant in the realm of adoption. Um, for the longest time, I felt like living my truth would hurt people that I cared about, and that made it really tough, to just be authentic. And I've come to a place now where I can be authentically myself, even if that makes people uncomfortable, and recognize that I can have both positive and negative experiences related to my adoption, and all of those things are valid. So I'll definitely share a bit in terms of my own experience, as well as just some larger trends that I have learned. Um, but I also want to mention it's so important not to sort of sit here and compare myself to other adoptees. We say this all the time, but no one is a monolith, right? And this is my perspective. It's real and valid. However, it might be super different than an adoptee that someone else knows. So I think that's important. The big thing for me, as far as just my own personal experience, is I have grown to realize now and have the ability to verbalize that it's very much rooted in pre-verbal trauma and ambiguous loss. And that involves a lot of this sort of ambiguous grief, because it began with this maternal separation that for the longest time I felt, but was not validated on the, in the external ways that we all need. And so it took me a very long time, probably till I was in my 20s, to even acknowledge that it was really there. An example of that, I think, a couple examples that I've definitely related with other adoptees as well are birthdays. Like holidays can be strange. This is going to sound a little dark, but it's coming from a place of wanting to help with understanding. So with birthdays, this duality shows up kind of aggressively. On one hand, my birthday is a celebration and, filled with gratitude and people that I love. On the other hand, my birthday represents a day that I completely lost all of my original identity, culture, family, language. There's so much to that. And so I've always kind of had this weird combination of emotions on those days. Same thing with Mother's Day. um, it's a reminder every year that there's this complicated reality for me in terms of what that means. Um, and so it's, it's definitely been reckoning with that duality, I think, and that's probably the most definitive thing for me is like moving from either or to that both and mindset has been really helpful for me as I've gotten older.
Thank you for sharing that. So when it comes to your identity, is being do you define as part of who you are as being adopted, or do you not even look at it that way? Like how much of it is on the top of your mind when you're speaking to people and connecting with people?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, I think in general, adoptees are often sort of infantilized. Like when we talk about adoptees in the media, when you think about the adoption stories maybe you've seen on in movies or TV, and there's like one major exception I can think of, they're often children and babies, right? And for me, being a transracial adoptee is a huge part of my identity, if not one of the most deep rooted, important pieces. If someone asks me about my race, my culture, I will say it. I feel comfortable doing that now, um, because I think there's so much about it that is important for me to really truly identify with. But I'll admit it took me a long time to be able to say that, and there was a long time that I would even refer to it as internalized oppression. That's something I have learned a lot about from some wonderful people, including a clinical psychologist who's an adoptee that I've learned a lot from. Um, and so it took me a long time to get there, but now in fully realizing sort of my identity at this point, it's absolutely a hugely important thing for me to identify with.
Yeah, and I just can't imagine how lonely it must have felt growing up, because for me, I would go to an all white school and I would feel the difference there, but then when I came home, I
Mm.
had family members that looked like me and that could relate to me. I had a twin sister that could exactly relate to me. So I can only imagine how feeling different in both your home space and then in the outside world must really shape who you are and your self-esteem even, and just have psychological effects that a lot of people cannot relate to.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think the whole racial isolation thing, like that's real and absolutely a form of racial trauma. So definitely can relate to that.
Yeah. So I want to share with everyone, you wrote a blog on your website for 7525, and it was a blog
Mhm.
called In Truth and Solidarity. And you spoke about just how growing up you felt your differences. You spoke about how your brother pointed out in class one day or in school one day that you could never become president of the United States because you weren't born here. And you had different microaggressions from your family members. But at the end of the blog, I wanted to share this little piece that you wrote. And you said, "This is not a story of sadness or self-pity. It is merely a story. Nothing more, nothing less. International transracial adoptees are certainly not a monolith. Yet it sometimes feels we are more invisible than ever in a year like this one. I am okay taking a back seat. I am okay being quiet. Until my Black friends and my East and Southeast Asian friends are safe, I am okay here, a bit gray, a bit confused, and yes, a bit lonely, but not really lonely at all. All of our realities wash into each other in waves in search of a life beyond survival." So that like last sentence hit me, a life beyond survival, because it's like all we're all trying to feel is validated and seen, and like we're not climbing above water. But it also made me feel like, it's taken over 200 years in the death of innocent Black men and women for Black lives to finally become part of the conversation. And then the AAPI crimes to make Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian lives part of the conversation. So I can imagine that, when it comes to humanity, we can't prioritize one over the other, but at the same time, there's certain groups that's not part of the conversation. So are there any, I guess my question is, are there any resources that we can link into or get connected to that help us get more articulate and fluent in this conversation about transracial adoptees? Any websites we can go to, anything that you like to look at or listen to?
Sure, absolutely. A couple of things come to mind in terms of websites. One would be Beyond Word Psychological Services. That is owned and run by an adoptee who is actually from India as well. And she has just a multitude of resources on her website, including an entire directory of adoptee therapists or informed therapists, which is huge in this world. It's kind of hard to find, honestly, as an adoptee. It's not something that's super common. And then as a transracial adoptee, even, you know, the issues in mental health with whether or not people are racial trauma informed, are they using anti-racist practices? That shows up too. So her website's a great place to start in terms of just resources and other places to look. I would also, look up Adoptees for Justice in terms of the human rights side of things. Adoptees for Justice, their big initiative is related to citizenship for intercountry adoptees. Something that a lot of people don't know is that there are quite a few stories of adult adoptees who have been deported to countries that they're unfamiliar with and might not even speak the language. So mental health is a huge piece, and adoptees actually often struggle with mental health, just statistically speaking. A few years back, I think it's the Academy of Pediatrics released a study with findings that showed adopted children are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-adopted children, which maybe should have come with the content warning. I'm sorry, but it's a very, very intense statistic that I think on one hand can feel really depressing. On the other hand, I know for some adoptees it's actually felt healing because in a way it's really validating in terms of a lot of those experiences. And the other thing I would say to look at online is the Adoptee Rights Law Center. And so again, with the human rights issues, that's going to be more focused on original documentation. And so access to your original birth certificates and things like that, which again is a really massive issue. And then I also I did posted a few this morning, but I'll make sure to put a few more up on my own 7525 Impact Instagram, LinkedIn links. I'll make sure to share some accounts of places to follow, to read, to learn from that know way more about this than me. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And as we're speaking as well, some of our participants put some stuff in the chat that looks really helpful. So I'm going to be sure to check that out, and we will be sure to include those links in our recap email that goes out after this conversation. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, before our conversation, I just wanted to make sure I was informed. I did read up on that 2001, the Child Citizenship Act, right? And that there was a neutralization process for certain prospective parents and retroactively granted citizenship to lots of adopted children. But if you were 18 or over at the time, it didn't help you, and you had to be deported back to a country that you may not even have any relation to or any connection to. So that's so horrible and frightening that that was something I didn't even know was going on. So thank you for opening our eyes to that. So in what ways has your experience influenced your work and network?
Sure. I mean, in terms of my work, I think personally the constant learning, I have this drive to understand things in a really deep way. Um, that I cannot quell. And I think that lends itself well to an industry, like DEI, social impact, cultural humility, these things that there really is no endpoint. It's very much nonlinear, really consistent lifelong learning. I also think just that natural desire to create connections and build, bridges. It's something that I've almost had to do since I was really young, which it sounds like you can kind of relate to actually, in terms of that understanding of, being in environments where there is no racial mirroring, and kind of needing to find ways to sort of explain that. I think it lends itself well to having conversations that are direct and honest, but also potentially, you know, can widen perspectives and sort of expand perspectives there. Professionally speaking, though, I mean, honestly, I'm just a nerd. I have never stopped being sort of addicted to learning and problem solving, and that's absolutely what I love about the work that I do. So,
That's so awesome. And I know you focus a lot on cultural humility. Um, can you speak a little bit about that? Just explain what it is for those who may not know and some best practices, tips that you like to provide.
sure. Yeah, cultural humility. I mean, I guess rather than kind of like digging into definitions, I think cultural competence is probably the more familiar phrase. And what I love about cultural humility is it's sort of taking that one step further. And it's not about having this sort of like finish line where, I understand this much about this many different cultures. It's really about decentering yourself. That's sort of the root of humility as a general concept is decentering yourself in the same way that in this work, a lot of the time we're trying to sort of decenter the dominant culture, So in anti-racism work, there's absolutely for me this really, you know, like huge emphasis on decentering whiteness. It's not easy, not always possible. I'm not going to say that I literally do that every single time that I'm in a session or anything like that. But I do think that decentering yourself, decentering the dominant culture, um, that is something that is hugely important to sort of growing your understanding. Is really truly acknowledging that other experience as real, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So I want to get back and hear a little bit more about your adoption experience. What are some myths that are out there about adoption?
Sure. Um, there are plenty. I think one sort of overarching, I don't know if it's a myth, but definitely maybe it's just incomplete. This idea that adoption is love. I hear that a lot. I heard that a lot growing up. Um, and phrases like that, phrases like "you're so lucky" or things surrounding gratitude can actually be kind of triggering for adoptees, because the more that you kind of dig into it, the more, for me, I became aware that adoption is a big business. It is literally exchanging human bodies for capital. And so that, in sort of understanding that bigger picture, is there love involved in adoptions? Yes, of course. And I love my family, but there is also business and there's also trauma and loss of identity and language and a lot of those things that we talked about in terms of racial isolation and some of those traumas, and even the presence of white saviorism, I think is worth mentioning too. And yeah, so I mean, for me, I don't know if they're myths. I think that it's just incomplete, and for me, I want to kind of push people to think beyond that positive narrative that a lot of us hear, and and maybe find a more complete version, that does have good and bad. For some people it's going to lean one direction or another. For me, I think it's very, very much both. So,
Thank you for sharing that. So how did cultural dynamics show up in your relationship with your parents?
that's a tough one. I'll just be totally honest. It's not something I've gotten completely comfortable talking about yet. It's still such a present piece of my life. It has not been easy. I think the the issues that both I have experienced and I've also heard from other adoptees are often rooted in this idea that when you want to explore your culture, so for me, I was born in India, and wanting to explore that can sometimes be interpreted by an adoptive parent as sort of like an attack. It can be interpreted as like, oh, I'm not enough, you're rejecting me, and it's not. That's not what it is at all, and I think that definitely has been a challenge in my life, is trying to help my family understand that. um, but you know I'm also fortunate to still have a relationship with my family, and there are a lot of transracial adoptees that do not have that at all. So it really varies. And for me, I grew up in a very multicultural family. I had within my immediate family, there was Lebanese, there's German American, there's Peruvian. Uh, it's all over the place. And so that in itself probably lent itself to some unique experiences too. But it really did take me until I was an adult, like in my 20s, 30s, to sort of feel free enough and safe enough to explore a lot of, those pieces of identity because there's, a little bit of a need to sort of protect my adoptive family from that, which I've learned very much so that it's okay to put myself first in that context.
And yeah, and I'm sure there's feelings of guilt on both sides. It's like you want to explore, but you're protecting your parents. And I'm sure your parents wanted you to explore, but they didn't know how to properly help you. So I can imagine there being guilt and awkwardness on both sides. So
hmm
thank you for sharing that. So, how are some ways that your family, or just in general best practices, how families can honor diversity within transracial adoptee relationships?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, even thinking about my family, I was adopted in the 80s. And so at that time, I relate sort of adoption blind adoptions to color blindness, you know. When I say adoption blind, it's not that I didn't know I was adopted. My parents look very white, so it's pretty clear from a young age. But it wasn't necessarily something that we dug into or discussed as a family. And I think in a lot of ways that relates. So adoption blindness and color blindness to me really relate. I guess I kind of experienced both, but they relate in the sense that they can really erase a lot of things. There's sort of a sense of racial gaslighting, if that makes sense, because you have all of these emotions and really deep grief and feelings of loss that are not necessarily validated in places that are important to you. So again, I don't think it was intentional by any means. I think that my parents did the best they could with the guidance that they had. And at the time, unfortunately, that guidance was, you know, it doesn't matter. That's your daughter, everything's fine. That has evolved so much. There are incredible resources available now. Beyond Words, like I mentioned, is a great place to start because there are so many resources there. And psychologists like her actually do consultations, with adoptive parents and families if that's of interest. I think the just from the sort of interpersonal level, like what can you do as a family to celebrate that diversity? I think just really clearly, loudly celebrate that diversity, and ask questions. Um, Definitely accept some of, the things that you can't necessarily provide. Something that I've heard from other adoptees is how valuable it was when their adoptive parents told them, like, of course you love your biological parents or first parents, or biological mother, maybe even more than me. Like having that said to them was actually amazingly helpful and helped grow that relationship. And recognizing that if you're, you know, adoptee, if you adopt and your child grows up like me to think really critically about this from big picture to small picture, that's a good thing, right? And not an attack by any means, but really an opportunity, I think, to share more and to share in that understanding and really embrace kind of them as that whole human. So for me, it's really about openness, and I think it for me it really does relate a lot to that question of like, can you talk about race with your toddler? Can you talk about race with your 6-year-old? And I am like a resounding yes. I just think that's so important, and taking the time to learn how to do that and really put effort into that is hugely important in a family that is multicultural.
Thank you so much. So we do have some questions rolling in. I want to cover one more topic and then we'll go into the questions. So over the years, you've connected with some fellow transracial adoptees. What has it been like connecting with them?
Great. It's been really complex. I think sometimes it's really, really validating because we can share in experiences, people talk a lot in the adoption community about trauma bonding. I think that's definitely relatable, and it can be sort of cathartic, understanding that you're not alone in a lot of these experiences. Other times, really challenging. It's really helped me see that, again, no one is a monolith, and that experience of sort of feeling tokenized or maybe needing to assimilate at a really young age, definitely big pieces of my reality and important to relate to other people, but then at the same time, I mean, most of the adoptees I know are actually transracial adoptees, and so there's this huge segment of the adoptee population that I probably know nothing about, um, so yeah, it's definitely been complex, but great. And the more comfortable I have been in sort of accepting my own identity, my own reality, the easier it has been to build those relationships, I think.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. So one of our participants today, I've been chatting with him on the side, Terry Keating, was adopted and he has some experience of his own that I want to invite him to share with the group.
Yeah, so I was adopted as a baby in 1958 in the state of Washington. And I have a sister by adoption, different biology. She was 6 when she was adopted by my parents. She had been in various foster care families and had suffered abuse. She was adopted in July. They adopted me in September. And that brought its own interesting dynamic into the family in the sense that my sister felt like she had finally come to a safe place, and then this bouncing little baby comes along, and it's kind of like stole her thunder in a way, so to speak. And so that's been an interesting journey. But as I was hearing some of the early things that Shanta was saying, it so resonates, the conflicting feelings. On the one hand, twice blessed, brought into the world, picked by my parents, so twice blessed. The other side of that coin, though, my biological mother didn't do anything that she had to do in order to keep me. And so, I hear things and we talk about unconditional love. And so there became a condition on it that she gave me up for adoption. But she was doing what she thought was going to be the best thing for me and that I would have a better life. And I recognized that that was a sacrifice for her. Over my years, I've talked to lots of birth mothers who tell me, not a day goes by that I don't think about that child and what happened to them. And so it's all these twisted and overlapping things that spin around, to which I don't think there's necessarily any good answer or any perfect answer. I've not made contact with my birth mother. The state of Washington is still a closed state, or at least it was last time I looked, and so it would be very complicated. And then I've asked myself, I don't know what I would want to ask. Part of me would want to ask, why did you give me up for adoption? Part of me would want to say, the family that raised me, I was safe, I've had a good life, they set me on a great journey. And so it's this big mixed emotion and this is the first time I've talked in this kind of environment about it, so sorry. Anyway, that's what I'd want to share with people, that I've been blessed, but it's still a tough place at times. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Terry. I really appreciate your insight and vulnerability, and it definitely helps me to understand sort of the torn place you feel in your mind. So thank you. So we do have a lot of questions that came through for Shanta. The first one is, can you share some insight as to how athletics and leadership have prepared you for your work today?
Sure. Yes. Thanks for asking that. It's funny as a sport, like in sports, so even as an athlete, as a coach, so much of what you do is either trying to convince yourself or convince your team that you're capable of doing more than you think, right? and and so there's this constant sort of motivator role that shows up, and not only that, but it's like you have to learn in every possible way. It's kinesthetic learning, it's verbal, it's visual, it's all of it, right? Sometimes all at the same time. And I think that's what I loved about coaching. It was so exciting because of that. Um, in that same vein, I think when we look at critical thought, inclusive leadership, cultural humility, any type of justice work, it involves all different types of learning. And it also involves, you know, patience and grace. You have to be willing to do the work to understand the people that you're collaborating with, people that you're working with, um, in order to reach anybody, right? In order to be an educator, a consultant, or a coach. I think that's so important to really be responsive and really do that work, Um, and I know there's certainly stereotypes about coaches where they kind of just like stand and yell, and that is just not how I see coaching. And 99% of the coaches I know are not like that. There's so much to it at that college level in terms of really understanding and getting to know your players, and your program and what that means. So I think the challenge for sure has helped me prepare the constant problem solving. Um, and a lot of the time when we get into like anti-racist, anti-bias work, one of the biggest hurdles is just getting people to realize that they can do this work, that they're capable over time, of learning and unlearning things. And so I think the motivation piece certainly has helped in that as well.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, before we went live, we were talking about how, because you played
Mhm.
lacrosse, I ran track in college, and definitely a lot of skill sets that you develop before you get into the business world. But also, I wish that my coaches had a DEI lens sometimes, because looking back, I'm like, oh, things they said were not that good. That wasn't the best way
Mhm.
that they coached me and encouraged me. So that's awesome that
Mhm.
you can draw parallels. Okay, our next question. Adoptive parents who do not share the same race as their children may often experience having to confront discrimination or racism faced by their children. What can parents do to better prepare for handling racial trauma when they arise and help their children develop a strong sense of racial identity?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I am certainly not the expert on this one, but I at least have some ideas. I think first and foremost, reckon with your own privilege. Don't wait until there's some kind of incident or a really blatant experience with racism or another type of discrimination to do something, right? Reckon with your own privilege. I I honestly feel like it's a lot like anti-racism work, in terms of having to reckon with your own privileges, and really understand your own identity and your complicity in certain systems and all that in order then to really understand those situations. So a whole lot of work. But I think the biggest thing is starting that work, um, from the get-go if you're even thinking about adopting, right? And if it gets to maybe for someone they're like, oh, but I didn't. And so I think in that case, one, it's never too late to do that learning, right, or unlearning. And also, being transparent about that, I think is amazing, and it's vulnerable and probably terrifying. I can imagine. I am not an adopted parent, but I just have to imagine, admitting that there is something to your child, no matter what it's about, that you don't know is hard. And so I think being willing to be vulnerable and transparent in that learning process and sharing that, um, and instead of maybe trying to fix it or make it better, just really working on understanding how that experience made someone feel, asking how they feel and what they need, rather than trying to find by research kind of like what they feel or what they need. I know that would have helped me. I can share a quick story. I literally went through as a sixth grader, went into a Walgreens in a predominantly white suburb of Chicago. We were on our way to like a day camp, and I was with my mom. She gave me a 20 and told me to buy 2 liters of pop. I say pop. I'm from Chicago, just for the record. Soda, whatever. So, so I go into the Walgreens with my 20 by myself. She waited in the car, and I buy 2 liters, 2 bottles of Sprite, and pay for it with cash. So I didn't have a receipt. And I was in sixth grade and tiny. I'm right now like 4'10", so at the time I was probably like 3 feet tall. And so I'm this tiny brown kid in a super duper white suburb. I walk out and the alarm goes off. So my heart kind of stopped. That had never happened to me before. Um, I just kind of stood there like this with these 2 big bottles of pop, like, what do I do? And I looked at the cashier. They didn't even acknowledge me. So if I was older, I might have just left, but at the time I felt like something went wrong. So the manager came out, and it was just a really terrible interaction. I mean, it went from lift up your shirt, lift up your pant legs, let me check your belt, all these things. Like, do you have anything in your pockets? And at that age, I literally had no idea what he was even talking about. I mean, I was so confused that I was almost convinced I did something wrong. I thought maybe there was a sticker on my foot or something, that set it off. So then that all happened. He threatened to call the police. I started bawling, crying. And so thankfully he did not. I think that maybe, triggered something, some kind of empathy in him, and he let me go with my pop and my change. And I go to the parking lot and I told my mom what happened, and it was very, distinctly, I remember just that disconnect. It was the first time I had really shared something like that. And there was absolutely a disconnect. Again, I don't blame her. It's just a matter of what you're capable of doing at the time. Um, but I think, having the opportunity to maybe share how I felt in the moment would have been helpful. And some of that transparency would have been helpful in a situation like that, for sure.
Wow, I'm so sorry you experienced that. Thank you for sharing. And I feel like racial identity empowerment has become more like relevant now than it was when I grew up in the 90s. And I remember going to school and getting made fun of for my hair and telling my mom that I want my hair to look like a white girl's hair. And she never once said, your hair is beautiful. It was always just like, you can't have white girl hair. So it just feels like the internal oppression among even parents of color was very relevant and evident back in the day, so to speak. So I can only imagine when there's an actual racial difference in the relationship, how hard that could be. But thank you for sharing that experience. We have another question. So this is from my coworker, Anam. As a South Asian woman myself, I have a good friend who is Indian, adopted by a white family. What are best practices from a friend's perspective to be supportive?
That is an awesome question. I appreciate that being asked. Um, so one of my best friends in the world is actually South Asian, not adopted, but you know, that's something that we've talked about. And again, the transparency. I think in terms of my experience over the last like 30 years, one of the very weird things about being adopted transracially is everybody knows. Sometimes they know before you know, and understand before you do. And for whatever reason, often it lends itself to this entitlement to like ask questions. So people have asked me very, very personal, confusing, sometimes painful questions from a very young age. And so as friends of adoptees, I would say, don't do that. I would say, tell them that, hey, I'm here and I'm interested and I love you and, all of those things, and offer it up, open it up, but don't necessarily ask those direct questions because every adoptee is in a different place. I want to thank Terry as well for sharing today because, you mentioned not having done that before in this type of space. And, it's just for me, a really helpful uh, example of how tough that is to do. And even in the space of like me with my friend, it's still really uncomfortable and still really hard because we are so immersed in this narrative that, like, personally, I don't identify much with, you know? And so I would say, don't dig, just offer up your support, ask what they need, you know, ask if that friend wants to talk about it. But the more specific questions, kind of like, oh, do you know your biological family? Or is it hard? Or are you going to adopt? I think those type of questions for me have been really triggering, and I appreciate when people kind of give me space to sort of initiate that type of conversation, if that makes sense.
Definitely does. And Terry shared, he said, one question that gets under my skin is, do you know who your real parents are? So I can imagine how that can be triggering. We have another question. What are some things you've done to feel connected to your race and culture?
It is a work in progress, let me tell you. I mean, really, truly, step one was probably just finding a way to get to this place where I'm like, I am Asian enough, I am Indian enough, and that was just a lot of internal work. Um, I saw an adoptee therapist actually that was life changing. So, to be totally honest, I could not recommend that more. Um, to be completely transparent, I also had some really negative experiences with another therapist who was not an adoptee, and I don't think that they were even doing anything wrong. It was just that there is a tendency for a lot of the experiences and the feelings of adoptees to sort of be pathologized. Like it turns into pathology, like imposter syndrome, attachment issues, like things like that people will tell you. Whereas what I've learned is like, this is just me healing from a very deep trauma that happened before I knew how to talk, and so it's not necessarily depression if I feel a certain relationship with death, which sounds really dark to people. It's actually just a part of who I am. And I think that has been hugely impactful for me is getting that support from someone who's done the research and really understands that layer.
It's awesome. Thank you for sharing. We have another question. Can you share your perspective on how transracial adoption impacts relationships across multiple generations? For example, your grandparent, parent, grandchild relationships. I ask because as the daughter of a woman who was adopted, I have experienced the complexities of how adoption impacts folks across an entire family system.
Hmm. Yeah, that is a huge question. I mean, I can say just from, my own experience, it's kind of like any generational trauma. It is going to have an impact in a way that is bigger than just me, bigger than just any one person. Um, and I have definitely, something that I have, I guess without kind of oversharing, but something that I have seen and heard quite a bit of that is not my personal experience, but I've heard from very close friends that when you're an adoptee who doesn't have any biological relationships intact, so I don't actually, I don't know any of my biological family. All of those records were essentially destroyed when I was an infant, so I really didn't have a way um, to find that even in trying. So so then when you think about having children, it's this whole enormous layer of, wow, that's the first time that I've seen or felt that biological connection, And so I think that can um, certainly have a really big impact on relationships in good and bad ways, And again, that's not my personal experience because I don't have children yet, but I do think that it's irrelevant. And um, again, no one is a monolith, and I think that is so unique. Like, I am coming from this perspective of an international adoptee who can't access, records or family members, and then I have a lot of friends in the U.S. who are adopted here through the foster system, actually, that while maybe they technically have access to certain things, don't have that relationship or don't have those connections intact for other reasons. So I think it is so complicated, and it depends on the relationship, absolutely. If it's comfortable, the ability to actually talk about that stuff specifically in those relationships, I think can be so powerful. But I also know that, I mean, that trust and that level of sort of vulnerability can be, it can take time, and can be really, really tough to find too.
Thank you. And I want to amplify something Sophie said in the chat. She's also adopted. So another thing about being adopted is that sometimes it's hard to know how being adopted has affected you later in life. For example, I often wonder, do I have trust issues because I was adopted and everything that came with that in terms of being left in a public space to be found, or in an orphanage for a few months, etc.? Or do I have trust issues for another reason? It's difficult to know what comes from what. It's very true. Okay, so we have a question from Nika. What are some best practices that workplaces should adopt to support families who are adopting? Are you aware of a growing trend of employers considering this in the maternity-paternity leave policy?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And also thank you, Nika, just for the opportunity to chat today. Um, I think it's unfortunately it's really rare. I have definitely seen certain trends in certain areas. I'm working majority of the time in higher ed and in athletic spaces. So I'll say in professional athletics, there's a trend, yes, which is amazing because I'm seeing a lot of work being done specifically by the WNBA, honestly. But then also there's it's called Athletes Unlimited. So a new organization that is running volleyball, softball, and lacrosse leagues. This started last year and it's moving into the summer. And they have been really putting it out there, in terms of their family leave policies and including adoption in there as well, which I think is awesome. But from my experience, and totally correct me if there's other things that I should know, in my experience, family leave in general is so just lacking here that that generally when there are great policies, it's almost like I'll see adoption included, but those policies overall are so rare that I hope that it's certainly trending up, and I hope that it's growing. But yeah, that's a great question. Something that I'll have to learn more about myself, honestly.
Thank you. It's great insight. So we have about 5 minutes. I would love to hear more about 75-25 Impact. I would love to hear the story behind the name, first of all, and just your mission, some of the clients that you're helping industry-wise, anything you'd love to share.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So 75-25 Impact, the name is straight from my experience in coaching. So in certain sports, there's 50-50 balls. So that's in lacrosse and basketball. There are basically these loose ball opportunities like rebounds, ground balls in lacrosse, draw controls, face-offs, jump balls in basketball, that a lot of times in coaching, you kind of like think about those moments as the pieces of the game you can control, right? So as a coach, I was constantly trying to emphasize that stuff because if you're winning the 50-50 balls, you're winning possession. And then, in theory, the outcome of that process should be a win. What we did in scouts with my teams for like 8 years was instead of putting 50-50 on the scout, we would put 75-25 with the intention of kind of saying, if we put more emphasis on the controllables, if we put more emphasis on the things in our control, and really focus on that stuff, right? So kind of ignore the scoreboard and redefine success on our terms, then the outcome will be a win, right? But also, even if we don't win, we're going to feel like, look, we did everything in our power to really do the best that we're capable of today. So it's straight from my lacrosse scouts, and it felt like something that really applied to this work because, again, it is really challenging. I think it's constantly changing and evolving. It involves so much consistent learning, right? And so finding time to kind of like scale back and focus on those things you can control, right? The facts and your own lived experience. Something I actually introduce myself in sessions with a core value and a boundary, and I'll say, as that core value, as a woman of color, my lived experience will never be outweighed by my learned experience. And that's something that I hold very dear. And then as a boundary, I also will just say kind of bluntly that my race and ethnicity is not a mystery for you to solve so that I don't get that what are you question right away. But but for me, having those really clear things, those core values, along with healthy boundaries, both personally and professionally, allows all of us then to do this really tough work of equity and inclusion, anti-racism. And for me, all of it's driven by critical thought. It allows us to do that in like a way that is healthy and sustainable. And so that's really where that name came from. That's kind of long-winded, but
I love that. I love that you connect your athletic background. So that's awesome. So we have about 2 minutes left. I want to just end by asking you, is there anything else that you want to share that we didn't cover? We're so very grateful to have you today. So I do appreciate your time so much.
Sure. Again, thank you, first and foremost. In terms of the transracial adoptee life, the last little thing I'll say in terms of, action steps or what can you do to maybe learn more about it, is support and really empower stories, books, film that center adult adoptees. I think that is huge. It might be a little tougher to find, but it's worth finding. Um, I I know for me, if you had asked me any of these questions when I was 12, it would have really not been the same answers because so much of what I thought I knew at that point was just, trying to survive and kind of understanding that world. So centering adult adoptees for me is really important. Um, and then just like, little plug for my company, 7525 Impact. We do some great work in higher ed with college athletics, administrators, coaches, as well as nonprofit leaders is the bulk of what I'm doing right now. And I'm more than open to continuing to find new clients and really push this work forward. And we're education based, so I think that's really the foundation for me. But I also do some one-on-one coaching that I love. The passion there lies in supporting, honestly, people that, especially Black, Indigenous, women of color in predominantly white places, which is most of athletics, to be honest. And so that is a huge passion of mine too. But yeah, 7525 Impact. We're on all the socials, and then it's just 7525impact.com as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing and being here today, Shanta. We appreciate you. We value you. Look through the chat. It's blowing up with gratitude. This is an amazing conversation. Everyone who attended, thank you. Thank you so much for attending. Please attend next week at 11 a.m. Eastern to join Dr. Nika White with her co-host. Thank you.